In the last chapter, we took a look at how neurons function. And in this chapter, we're going to take a look at how they operate in the larger system. We're going to begin by spending most of the chapter looking at the central nervous system, and then we will take a few minutes to take a look at peripheral nerves and how they work in relation to that, and we'll finish up by looking at some reflex arcs. So if we start just by remembering, we got our central nervous system, that's the brain and spinal cord. We know that sensory neurons are our input, information that's coming in, so we say that they are afferent in nature. And then we have motor neurons, which are neurons coming out of the central nervous system. So they're our output, or they're going to be efferent, E for exit again, in nature. And then we've got that third type of neuron, association neurons or interneurons. This is going to be our integration part of the system. This is what most of that entire central nervous system is going to be made up of, those neurons that are in between the sensory and the motor, the final motor output neurons. And it's these association neurons that are going to be the key to directing our response to maintaining homeostasis. So when we talk about our integrating centers in that whole loop of homeostasis, it's these interneurons that are going to be our integrators, and they're going to be making up things like our thalamus and our hypothalamus and lots of parts of our cerebrum and how that communicates to each other. So we're going to take a look at all of these. What I wanted to point out on this slide, this is a picture taken from your book, and in the book it said that this low part right here was the spinal cord, and that's not exactly true, because here you're going to see this is our pons and our cerebellum, and just below the pons here will be the medulla oblongata. So I wanted to clarify that for you. The spinal cord is going to be where that medulla oblongata exits the foramen magnum of the skull, which will be somewhere right in here, but I just didn't want you to skip that part of this slide. Okay, so if we look at embryonic development, how the nervous system develops, it's going to start, remember, all the nervous system comes from the ectoderm. We have the ectoderm, mesoderm, and endoderm, the inner layer, middle layer, and outer layer. And this is how we get it from that outer layer. You can think of these three. Here's going to be our ectoderm, our mesoderm, and our endoderm. You can kind of think of it like that. Well, that ectoderm is going to fold in on itself and invaginate here. And we're going to have these little bulbs up here called the neural crest, and where it kind of invaginates in on itself, we're going to call that the neural groove. And those are going to fold together over on each other, and we're going to get this neural canal and a neural crest. The neural crest is going to be part of the peripheral nervous system, and the neural tube is going to be part of the central nervous system, which kind of makes sense if you just think about how they're formatted. They're going to go from inside to out towards our periphery. So if we start at about 4 weeks of development, that neural tube is going to grow into 3 different bulbs here. And those bulbs we're going to name the prosencephalon, or what we call the forebrain. We're going to have a middle section called the mesencephalon, or the mesencephalon. That's going to become our midbrain. And then we're going to have what's called the rhombencephalon, or hindbrain. So these little bulbs are all developing in about 4 weeks. And then a week later, they're going to differentiate. And that prosencephalon is going to differentiate into the telencephalon and the diencephalon. The telencephalon is what you're going to see is really going to be our cerebral hemispheres. And within them, we're going to have those lateral ventricles that are making our cerebral spinal fluid. So these are the cavities within the walls of the hemisphere. It's also going to make the diencephalon. And the diencephalon, you'll probably be more familiar with. The thalamus and the hypothalamus and the epithalamus are going to be the main parts of that diencephalon. And within them, we're going to have the third ventricle, which is where those 2 lateral ventricles come together, and they make one that's right in the middle, in between the 2 thalami. The mesencephalon, the midbrain, is going to continue to be called the mesencephalon, and that is simply going to be our midbrain. And in the midbrain, we're going to have the continuation of those ventricles as one long canal we call the cerebral aqueduct. And you're going to see how that's going to join up to the 4th ventricle. In the rhombencephalon, we divide it into the metencephalon and myelencephalon. The metencephalon becomes the pons and the cerebellum, and the metencephalon is going to become our medulla oblongata. So the fourth ventricle is kind of divided between all of these guys. Most of it is spent between the pons and the cerebellum, and you'll see a picture of this in a little bit. And a little bit is going to leak into the medulla oblongata, where it will eventually leave the spinal cord, or go through the spinal cord as a central canal. So if we take a slice through the spinal cord, and this is a frontal slice or a coronal slice through the brain, you'll recall that we've got gray matter and white matter, and gray matter is simply going to be where all the cell bodies are, and the cell bodies have all those Nissl bodies on it, and that's what's going to make them gray. So you're going to see in the cerebrum, we'll have all this gray matter towards the outside on the cerebral cortex, and there will also be a couple of nuclei within the cerebrum that are going to be collections of cell bodies as well. Where it's white is going to be our axons, and those axons are mainly myelinated, and that's what gives them the white color. When we look at the spinal cord, that's going to be looking just the opposite of the cerebrum. In the spinal cord, you're going to see the gray matter basically going deep and inside, and that's because that's where all the cell bodies are here. We're going to have neurons that are coming in from the outside and synapsing here in this dorsal gray horn, and that's why you're going to see a lot of cell bodies here. Some of them are going to come over and cross, and you'll see cell bodies here, or you'll see cell bodies or neurons coming down and making synapses in these ventral horns before they go out as motor neurons. So all of this stuff in here is going to be gray matter, and all of the white matter on the outside are going to be the tracks of the neurons going up and down the spinal cord. And we're going to hit those the very end part of this lecture. That's just kind of a quick introduction to the central nervous system. Next up, we'll start looking at some of the individual parts of the cerebrum.